So our guest today is the executive and artistic director of the Hyde Park Jazz Festival. Please welcome Kate Dumbleton. I had to show the whole video because it had that big long trombone solo. So
it's a very old video.
So you've done a lot of things in the presenting space. Now you run Hyde Park Jazz Fest. You owned a venue in San Francisco for some time. How did you get into this presenting music game?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. So nice to see y'all. Accidentally. Totally accidentally. After college, I worked in corporate America, which I hated. And after 4 years or so of that, I just decided I'm not going to get roped into this deal. I want to do something else. And so I had been transferred from New York City to San Francisco. And so I decided that I was 26 at the time, and I decided I was going to kind of go into exploratory mode. So I quit my job and I got a bartending job. Smart move on that and that. And one of the place where I worked, there was a guy that came in all the time who ran a booking agency. And he just would kind of sit there at the bar and lament different aspects of the business. And one of the things was that he had a sort of little part of the business that was jazz. And he was finding it hard to keep up with everything because he was mostly doing rock music and stuff like that. But he loved the jazz part, but just was having a hard time keeping up with it. And just because I was sort of in the mood to, I was just exploring what I wanted to do next, I said, I love jazz. I love music. I don't know anything about the business at all, but if you teach me how to do the booking, I'll do it for you for free, like trade, So that's exactly what happened. He taught me how to do booking stuff, and this was mostly restaurants, supper clubs, little jazz gigs, nothing, some private parties, no like serious clubs. But I just immediately fell totally in love with it. I had an instant simpatico with the musicians. I was very interested in what they were doing. And also because I was coming from a business background, my brain would click into like helping them think about, what was their career trajectory and putting together materials. At that time, it was like really analog, so it was cassette tapes and stuff and, packages that you mailed to the clubs and to the talent buyers and stuff. And so in particular, I got to be very good friends with a bass player named Marcus Shelby, who was starting a record label. And he was a super interesting, very kind of collaborative, cross-sectoral thinker and composer. And so he was working with dancers and with film people and with theater people, and he just needed someone to help manage all the projects. So again, I just was like, okay, I'll learn that now, And so I just set myself to really just teaching myself how to do all the different aspects of managing projects. And I was super lucky because working with Marcus, he was so collaborative that I never stayed only in the music part. It was like, oh, okay, now I got to think about how theater people work and how to film people work and, making a film and putting the music in the film. And so all of that stuff. And then meanwhile, when I started working with that other guy that I first met, eventually what happened was I got a job booking a club from working with him. And then I got some jobs helping with some festival stuff. And then I met Marcus. And then some nonprofit organizations wanted to start composer residency programs. And so I would help with that. And so I was kind of like throwing myself into these different sectors, which, I don't know if y'all are thinking about the way that different music crosses over between for-profit, nonprofit, community sectors, education. But it was totally lucky that I just kind of was into these different components and sort of learning them in real time.
Do you feel there's a common thread across those things? Booking, the sort of, seemed like some of what you were doing was management. And then on the venue side, like what are the things they have in common? The skills that work in all those places?
That's a cool question. Well, I think that, for me, I was also lucky because I came at it from working with musicians. So it was always for me about the music first, rather than coming at it from the business perspective. So my interest was that first, which was a way for me to start thinking about all the other stuff, which I think that, and then of course working with musicians who are improvisers, that's a worldview in a sense. Sure. So it was also that I was learned how to put things together. So I think if the common skill is some capacity to think in a collaging kind of way, so that you're not just moving down a path and here's the path and if you do this, that will happen. It was much more like patching things together. And I think booking is like that in a lot of ways too, right? Because for me, I was in particular very interested in more experimental music or maybe music that wasn't going to be as commercial. But then at the same time, I had to think about, when I was booking clubs, I had to think about the owner of the club and the fact that that guy or girl wanted to make money. So then you have to think about, okay, if I want to do this arty thing, I might have to do this more pop thing. And you put those things together and you figure out how to make the economics of it work. And if you do a pretty good job, then the club owners and other people will start to trust you a little bit so that maybe you can take a risk one night and they won't be super mad if it doesn't make a lot of money. And so I think the ability to kind of think across people's needs, so the club needs this, the musicians need this, the audience needs this, and you're kind of thinking about what you're doing from the standpoint of different people interacting with that system.
Right, and it is an ecosystem, right?
Totally.
So I run a Tuesday night series of fairly experimental music, and people are like, oh, well, we should make, whatever, $100 a person or $200 a person. Like, but that money's not in the system. If the total of the club bar ring is $300, and what gets taken at the door is $100, there's no way the band's getting $600. Like, it's just, and well, I mean, you could do that for a couple weeks and then the club would close and you wouldn't have a place to do the thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think sometimes the complexity of that is that people perceive value differently, right? So, of course, the musicians, the value of their work is almost always more than you can pay them at a certain level. When you're talking about stadiums and whatnot, you're still dealing with like what's the maximum ticket price you can charge, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly in the space of more experimental or new work, the conversation about value is so hard because it's just, like you said, there's not dollars in the ecosystem, regardless of the value of the person's talent.
Right.
You know.
And so you find the value in other places. Like we both do a lot of fairly experimental music, and maybe the issue you have is you have fairly mainstream music, but nobody knows who you are. So then the commercial value of that is the same. Nobody knows what it is. So then what is the value you get from maybe having a place to present that thing has value to you? And then the trick becomes how not to give away that value when you then have monetary value that you're still not getting, right? Finding that balance. For those of us making more experimental stuff, it's longer term before the monetary value comes in, although it does get there eventually.
Sure, yeah.
So tell me about the venue you ran in San Francisco. Describe it a little bit for them.
Sure. So the first club I ran was this big supper club, and they had, it was beautiful. It was like an old warehouse. And there's a stage upstairs, and we had 9 shows a week, and it was everything from jazz to rock and other stuff like that. And then that club burned down, very suspicious fire. And I didn't do it though. But and then I was running a very cool club. If anyone's been to the Bay Area, maybe you've been to Cafe du Nord, very famous club that had a lot of super great, like early rock groups, indie stuff. And so I ran that club, and that was like a nightclub.
And when you say ran that club, like booking the music, managing the bar, doing the whole thing.
Yeah. And then eventually, I had helped people open a couple of places, and at one point, I had a friend who was like, "You should open your own place," and I was like, "No way," because I had seen it. It's so hard. But eventually he did talk me into it, and we found a cool little spot in the Tenderloin area, which was then kind of edgy. It's now much more mainstream, but it was a kind of an art bar, really. So my whole idea was to create sort of an art center space. So we had artist studios in the basement, and then the artists that were in the basement were curating exhibitions. And it wasn't like coffee shop art. It was really excellent. There was they had a great network of artists they were working with. And then we had some music performances in there. But it was like a European kind of cafe vibe. So it went all day and then into the night. So during the day, people would come in and have coffee and hang out. And then at night, they'd come have wine and shoot pool and listen to music and stuff like that. And I had that for 6 years.
So having been in the sort of for-profit venue management and now working in the nonprofit festival space, are there any essential differences in those two spaces? I mean, I guess sometimes I talk about it as like in the for-profit world, the job is to make money and you find a thing to do to make money. In the nonprofit world, the job is to make art and you find a way to make that sustainable. But I guess when you're doing less mainstream things, even in the for-profit world, it's similar in those ways.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, does anybody know, why do we have the nonprofit sector? Does anybody know? It's always a stumping question because it's so obvious that no one knows it. The nonprofit sector in this country exists because there are needs that are unmet by the for-profit sector, right? So there's some things that there is no way to set a ticket price that people would pay where it would be sustainable. So the orchestra, like if you wanted to go to the symphony, if it were a for-profit, the ticket would be $1,000 or something like that, right? So what's cool about the nonprofit sector is it's essentially collective organizing around those unmet needs. And in the United States, we have the nonprofit sector because we've made the decision in democracy that we don't want the government to take care of everything, right? So really in this country, the nonprofit sector as it relates to the arts is driven by the decision that we want everyone to have the individual choice to support the arts, right? So actually, the way cultural policy works and the way the nonprofit sector works in the arts in the US is through the tax code. So if anybody's ever like, what's cultural policy? It's our tax code, because it allows individuals to make donations and write them off, right? So there's this whole structure for that. But at the end of the day, nonprofits are actually businesses. But instead of making profit, the shareholders are the community. And so the any profit that a nonprofit makes goes actually back into the organization. So nonprofits can be, and hopefully are, profitable, but the money goes back into the organization rather than being paid out to shareholders. So in a sense, it's important to know that like the Hyde Park Jazz Festival is a nonprofit, but I run a business. It's a business. I just don't give the money out to any shareholders.
Right, like it's still got to be a black number at the bottom of the sheet at the end of the year.
I still got to pay for everything that I use. I got to pay staff. Got to, get all the permits, all that kind of stuff. We just don't pay any taxes to the government, and anyone that contributes money to us can take a tax write-off on their personal tax.
Right, and if you go, and a more common model like in Europe is tax money goes to pay for these cultural events. So the American version has flipped it that I get tax incentives to donate to the Hyde Park Jazz Festival, but it's much less likely to have large amounts of government money funding music festivals, for instance.
Yeah, like we have the National Endowment for the Arts, right? But it's quite small.
Although some municipalities, this kind of ties in. Chicago has quite a festival culture. It's a little bit like New Orleans. They have festivals for everything. And some of them are funded by the city, or at least partially funded by the city. Do you find that festival culture affects how you run your festival? Like, could it be the same in a different city? Or is the context of Chicago an important part of what the Hyde Park Jazz Fest looks like?
Yeah, I mean, Hyde Park Jazz Festival is on the south side of Chicago, and that's everything to the festival itself. It was started by community members who have a pop-up club every Sunday night, and they were interested in starting a jazz festival, so they got a little seed money from the University of Chicago. And it was so popular that they just kept going from there. But the history of the music on the south side of Chicago is huge and super diverse in terms of stylistic exploration, the types of artists that have been there historically and currently. And so it's a blast for me to curate it because I have a zillion histories to draw from, and there's an audience and an interest and a kind of context for me to be doing that. And it's all right there. So it's not, the festival itself is like coming out of the earth. It's like in the water. So that is really cool. I spend almost no money on marketing, almost no money, because people just come. And a lot of that is because it really is connected to the area and the city itself. And
that's an interesting thing when we do things in sort of community senses. How do you stay connected to that community? And you recently sort of had an expansion of the jazz festival. I'm going to play this video now.
Back Alley Jazz has always been a feeling. Back Alley Jazz was inspired by the historic Back Alley Jazz from the 70s. in the south side of Chicago, and we wanted to revive it for today.
The 4 homes on one block donate their backyard, and that the street would be blocked off, and that we'd create this festival.
Artists and designers came together in community to produce a one-day event with music, with art, with design, just to have a good time and to be together.
From what I knew of Back Alley Jazz, it was where my father used to go and listen to a DJ jam session.
My father and people like Jimmy Ellis. Jimmy Ellis is a great saxophonist. Jimmy would get his friends to come, and so it became a scene.
All the people in the community, from the elders to the children, would be together. I didn't have no idea it would take off like it did.
It grew and grew to a point where the authorities felt the need to shut it down. And then there have just been these efforts to resurrect that spirit.
All I ever wanna do is be where I can listen to a jazz band. Y'all say, jazz band, yeah.
How do we bring people to the Jazz Fest, this demographic of people that we know live close by, but they don't wind up at the Hyde Park Jazz Fest? Well, let's not try to bring those people here, but can we really find out a way to take this thing to them?
And Norman had some friends that were living on the block, and so we started to engage with those neighbors, and it quite literally organically grew from there.
One of the co-creators, Norman Teague, called me, and as he explained the idea, I didn't hear more so music, I heard sense of community. So I immediately said, I'm in.
When they were talking about it, part of me was going like, how are they going to put this together? But I didn't think it was going to be that big. So I kind of volunteered my sister's house.
I didn't know I was involved. So once it got started, I was driven.
She was definitely a driving force.
Yes.
That was really reassuring that those that said they were really in. Where do we have to meet? Who do we have to talk to? Because this thing is happening.
So I think you called me the day before and asked, is this really gonna happen?
And we had 600 people and on our block that 4 little houses were responsible for. I took that personally. I heard we had rave reviews.
Yeah, I can't keep saying the word phenomenal, but it was.
All the people that came up to me and, they were so grateful for us doing it, for allowing them in our spaces.
Just seeing all the people coming through, they were pouring into the alleys, trying to still see because the yards would become so crowded. It was magical. I wish we could activate this sort of thing all the time.
But there's also a level of education or introduction to our young people to the importance of this. So I think it's that part's really key as well.
It wasn't until last year at the festival that I saw the historical value, and I didn't see how much the music brought people together.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be a big back alley jazz, big event. It can just be neighbors getting together and telling stories.
We should encourage people on other blocks to just do the same thing, to get a permit, block it off, get some support from the neighbors and open out your yard, and just that simple.
It's important for the people that's right in this community to see what we're capable of. And people outside of the community gets a different view. In recent years, South Shore has gained a very terrible reputation. And I didn't want that to be the only thing you knew us by.
Back Alley Jazz is at its core about justice. It's about the right to express culture in your neighborhood and wherever you'd like to, and to ask for the resources to do that.
And so we thought the best outcome would be that the community would really own it and take hold of it. They actually did it, with us, to the point where, let's do this again next year. It became something more than just a project. Now it's not just a project. It's got a little bit of all of us in it. Yeah. So I really thank them for bringing that to us.
gonna let it keep playing because as you see the sponsor screens and things, it gives you some insight into how these things work. So that community connection, I think, is an important part of some of that nonprofit work. So do you find, well, this was just the first one this past year, or have you done it twice now?
I've done it twice now.
Do you find it feeds into the festival proper in ways, or are they sort of separate endeavors?
Well, they are separate endeavors. The Back Alley Jazz is in July, and the Hyde Park Festival is in September. And they have really different, in a sense, feels and this totally different scale, of course. But they have, in an interesting way that I hadn't totally anticipated, feed into each other. And honestly, it's like the Back Alley Jazz, I mean, y'all are in New Orleans, so you have this kind of community thing already, but a lot of places don't. So it was, it's been quite novel there to do this kind of thing. And a sort of radical hospitality. And it's actually helped me raise money for the festival itself because foundations and funders and people that want to make donations are excited by the Back Alley Jazz idea. And then they're like, okay, so we'll give you more money overall. So in that way, it feeds into.
I was noticing as we watched that video, there's some really like just stellar documentation of this. When the scene from the street, I was like, oh wait, that's a drone shot of the street while this thing's happening. Can you talk about the importance of documenting your work as it goes to being able to continue your work? Because I know we've told people even, like if you get a gig in a club, get a picture of the crowd at your gig because the full club can help you book the next gig. I see, yes. Or what Carlos was doing earlier.
Yeah, I mean, documentation is so important, and it's also like something that's so easy to overlook or forget, and it's also expensive, right? So you got to have the money to make that drone video, which is also an investment, and sometimes it's very hard to talk funders. In my case, you know, if in a nonprofit, funders into helping you make a video because that's not very sexy to them, but at the same time, they want it, right? So archiving is it's just super important. And thinking about also, you know, all of you want to see what you do over time. You really do. And also, that can also be something that you want to use down the road when you maybe are making a third record or your fifth record or something, and you want to be able to talk about where you came from, or the things things that you've done in the past. It can be actually really great marketing content to look at, to be able to demonstrate and show the trajectory of your work and your career. And then also, if you're looking to get sponsors, or you're working with agents, or you're going to become an agent, like all of this stuff is really important to how you get presenters to look at your stuff and to be invested in your stuff, because no matter what kind of presenter you're working with, for-profit, nonprofit, schools, community centers, whatever it is, everyone is dealing with marketing. Everyone. And so if you have that kind of content, it can be incredibly helpful, for sure. And finding teams of people to work with that you trust, that understand what your work is like, what the angle is, what the story is, you know, like those people really understood what the story of the festival was.
And you have to set that up ahead of time, right? Like before the festival, you can go interview people after, but the footage of it happening, you've got to be prepared to do.
Yeah, I mean, I just got a big grant to work on a project in 2020 and 21. The foundation said to me the other day when they like gave me the check, they're like, take pictures of everything. So the first meetings I had with the artists, I'm like with my iPhone going, taking the pictures for the foundation, you know, so, you know, because maybe that picture of you guys drinking coffee and writing in your notebooks is going to be something really useful, you know.
So, how many acts do you book for the Hyde Park Jazz Fest?
It's 35 concerts in 2 days on 13 stages.
So a bunch. So I'm sure more than that number of people want gigs at the Hyde Park Jazz Fest. How do you
Yes.
decide who plays and who doesn't? Notice I'm asking this question while I put up the slide of me playing at her festival.
Right.
I can tell you how that happened, but that's another story.
Does anybody out there want to be an artistic director or like a curatorial type person with music? Booking agent? Concert promoter? Okay. Well, developing your own approach to curating an artistic direction or presenting is serious business. Like, you really need to think about that a lot. And it keeps me up all the time because I'm always rethinking and thinking again and what am I doing? And so, for example, if I have 35 concerts, or if you're running a club down the road, or becoming a producer, or even picking you want to be an agent, and you're picking your artists, you want to think a lot about what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? So if I have 35 concerts to produce in an event that happens once a year, every decision I make about those 35 concerts probably means there's like another 50 people that are not getting that gig, right? And so for me, I'm always starting with the music and the context. So I book the Hyde Park Jazz Festival because it's the Hyde Park Jazz Festival. It's a totally different approach that I might have that if I was booking a bunch of clubs or a big venue or a different festival. So I'm always thinking about location and context. Like, if I'm doing it here, what matters here? So thinking about who's playing, who's doing interesting stuff around the city, what are the different styles that people are playing, and I want to have a broad audience, so I want to think about having a diverse group, different styles of the music. You know, we have a dance stage, we have experimental stuff, we have like blues inflected stuff, we have Latin, we have all these different elements to think about. And then also, you got to think about age diversity. So I want to have artists who are senior, veteran, important artists, as well as emerging artists and young people. I want to make sure that there's women band leaders and musicians, as well as the guys. I want to make sure that there's that the festival remains firmly connected to the origin story of the music, so the African American experience and artists making work today. And then also thinking about every venue. So each venue has different acoustics. Each venue has a different size. So you're not really going to put a band with a huge horn section in a room that's really super live, right? So I have to think a lot about each different venue and what would sound good there. And then at different times of the day, I have to think about different energy levels that I want to have. And then if I have a huge venue, then I need to have somebody that's more famous. So there's a zillion factors. And then also I want people to come and stay for a lot of the day. So I have to make individual pathways so that the people that are interested in one kind of music can go from show to show to show to show, and that the shows aren't all at the same time. So there's it's like a Rubik's Cube.
Right, and each one of those decisions sort of pushes on the other or influences. So how many of the acts that you book each year are things that you got some cold solicitation of, hey, I'd like to play your festival?
Not very many, although I will be honest, I listen to absolutely every submission I get. But for the most part, I am pretty aware of who's out there playing. Now, sometimes people will submit something and I'm like, that's pretty good. I like it. I don't have a space for it this year, but it's on my mind, and I have a notebook. I write down like people I want to think about the next year and stuff like that. But I go to, as you all will if you do this kind of work, it's like I go to a lot of different festivals around the country. I am always out listening to music at shows, and then I just listen to stuff all the time too, so I try to keep up. And then of course I have colleagues that are doing the same thing, so we're all talking about it also. So you feel like you've turned a lot of rocks by the time you get to that.
So if somebody submits something to you, what are some characteristics of the good submissions? What makes things stand out?
Yeah, okay, well, a couple pieces of advice. I get a lot of submissions where someone has paid exactly no attention to what the festival is, right? So they're like writing to me as if it's just a totally different thing than what it is. That takes my time. It makes me feel like there's no respect for the festival itself. And so that, do your homework if you're submitting your work to people. Understand what it is that they do, right? What is their festival?
And the same for clubs or whatever.
Clubs, absolutely. It's the same no matter what. Like, pay attention. Another thing is master the art of a 3-sentence note. Right? I get notes that are like emails that are this long. There's no way I'm going to read it. It's just too long. I'm too busy. You have to really think about being concise and sort of introducing yourself very quickly, saying what you do, and giving me the chance to listen to your stuff, right? And things that do work if you're relatively or mostly unknown is if you've played with people who are known, or if you have contacts or something with people who are known, that is very helpful because it does make me go, okay, well, if that person's played with so-and-so, then it takes me to a different place quickly, right? So I think the things that work the most for me are when someone writes to me as if they've paid some attention to what the festival is, and that they're concise, that they give me the music that they want me to listen to, a link to their bio, but not like a 1,000-page note about how great they are. That does not help me.
And don't be afraid to drop a name, but only if it's legit. I had a conversation with Manny Fresh on the corner by the Hi-Ho. Does not mean I worked with Manny Fresh, right? Yeah. The story of this is from a few years ago. We did a set of New Orleans music, and I had gone to Chicago in January. A buddy of mine put together this show around Alan Toussaint's birthday, and it was a charity fundraiser for New Orleans Charity, and we played a bunch of Alan Toussaint music. It was a lot of fun, except it was really cold outside. And Kate came to the gig, and a couple weeks later, Steve, the guitar player who coordinates the thing, called me. He's like, "Hey, you want to come back up for the Hyde Park Jazz Fest?" So Kate heard us and had this idea of this would be a great closer for the Sunday. We have the nice sort of unwind after the weekend of music kind of dance party. So I had to include the picture of Liam. He actually hopped off the stage and was dancing with the people. I forget what song we were playing there. So that's one of those things where we were just playing our gig and it click something for you like, oh, this fits into this thing. So I guess my point is being aware of who's around and always playing your best gig is like that presentation can matter in some way. So how many of the acts that you book are things that you saw out and about and were like, oh, that will fit into this part of that jigsaw puzzle?
I do that a lot. Yeah, for sure. Especially because because there's 35 concerts, which is a lot and not a lot. And so there has to be a reason why I pick everything. And so some of that, because I've been booking music for 25 years now, I feel there's some of it's a little intuitive. And also I now know the South Side, what the audiences want. And so I can kind of respond to things quickly. The other thing is, when you're in a position where you're programming things and everything, it's a big responsibility because you are making decisions about what histories are represented, right? And so for me, that's also, I think a lot about like, what things should I be advocating for? What's left out, right? Like what has been underserved by these presenting platforms over time? So women, for example, in jazz, totally marginalized, right? So been thinking a lot about, can I raise money to commission women composers, band leaders, and things like that, and then also making sure that young people have a chance and things like that. So and then a lot of times, I talk to musicians like all the time. I'm always talking to musicians, and sometimes they tell me like a good friend of mine was telling me about an idea that he's working on right now. And I went home and I like wrote it in my notebook. It'll probably be 2-3 years before I do anything with it. And he's not ready to do anything with it. But I really think it's a great idea, and at some point it will make sense.
Right. So let's go to some questions. If we can get it. Oh, they come on fast. Anybody have questions? Talia.
Would you like to come?
I was going to say, you can tell this is a senior looking at grad schools.
Well, I really love teaching. I've been teaching for 10 years now, 12 years. School of the Art Institute of Chicago is basically a museum school, right? So it's connected to the Art Institute of Chicago, which is a huge museum. And
fabulous museum.
It's like
Go
the
if you
most
get a
amazing
chance.
museum. So it's kind of cool because I'm one of the few people that deals with sound or music there. And so it's kind of interesting because I've learned so much about the visual arts and people making visual art, and that also informs my practice in music. But I love teaching in the program. It's amazing. It's a very interesting program that really is working on what is the future of organizing culture. What does it look like? What are the frameworks? What is the ecosystem of it? I think one thing you guys might think about in terms of what you're doing and what you're working on is, what's the future of this planet? Okay? And how are the arts going to be impacted? For example, if airplanes remain the way they are and the environment can no longer sustain air travel, what does that do to the music industry if artists cannot move around? Or if artists cannot get visas? Right now, it's extremely hard to get visas and stuff like that. So this is the kind of stuff we do in that program, is really think about like, whoa, what's the future of this landscape, and how does for-profit, nonprofit, all that stuff intersect? It's at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's a master's program in arts administration and policy. It's a 2-year program. And then also some people stay for a 3rd year and get a second master's in art history.
Talking about kind of the future in music, primarily festivals. So some artists, Loyola, kind of rethought concert design. And I don't know, I think festivals aren't a very new concept. They were designed for preservation of music. There are new and new designs and models, kind of seeing how live music is displayed.
That's a great question, and I think, there will have to be, right? Because, again, we have to think about the environmental implications of of the arts and moving people around, and the expense of doing all of this, and how we're going to create models that are going to be profitable for the people that want to create profit. And then also technology and the way in which people are consuming music is changing, and the sort of in my view, that the level of interactiveness that people want with music, and co-creative participatory culture that is going to, I think, redesign a lot of consumer models for sure. What that means for the kind of bringing together of people, which is what festivals are and why they're so great, is really, it's like basic human desire to kind of come together and dance around and listen to music and stuff. So on some level, how we recreate ways to do that is an interesting question, because I don't think we're going to sometime decide not to convene in for live events. It's just what's involved in those live events.
Yeah, it'll never just turn into a Facebook watch party, hopefully. Abby.
Can you talk about your experience getting sponsorship for the Hyde Park Festival and other nonprofit events?
Sure. So we have different kinds of sponsors. We have corporate sponsors. We have foundations in philanthropy that give us grants. And then we have sponsors that are some hybrid of that. So for example, the University of Chicago Medical Center sponsors us because they want to be perceived as contributing to the community that they work in. So what my job is to kind of think about potential avenues for sponsorship, and then try to get in front of those people and create a reason why they should contribute to the festival. So that is, in a sense, another way. You want to think about what matters to the sponsor, not what matters to you. So finding out what matters to different sponsors and then pitching to them around that. So knowing that the medical center wants to be perceived as contributing to their community, then I kind of create my pitch around that scenario. Whereas a sponsor like Xfinity or a cable company or Cadillac, I know that they want to be in front of the people that come to the festival because they've decided their demographic is there and they want eyeballs on their logo and all that kind of stuff. So then for them, I'm pitching more about the number of times they're going to see the word Cadillac pass their eyes, and how many postcards do we pass out that have Cadillac on it, and how many newsletters and how many Facebook, the kind of asset type thing. So it really depends on what kind of sponsor that I'm talking to. And then I work with a company that helps me pitch to different types of sponsors, and I focus on more of the nonprofit stuff. Does that make sense? It's like it's always about thinking about presenting a rationale based on the person you're trying to reach's needs, not your own.
Anybody else? All right, one more.
So you mentioned, like, when people are emailing you for booking for a festival or a venue, not screening before you send it to email. So what specific information are you looking for in those 3 sentences?
You can use 5 if you want, but mostly my point is to be concise. I would like to know how you would describe your music quickly, right? So what is it you're doing? Why do you think, again, kind of going back to what I just said about the way you would pitch a sponsor, like, why do you think the Hyde Park Jazz Festival would be a good festival for you to play at, not for you, but for the audience at the festival? Like, what makes you think it's a good fit? I'm super interested when people say to me, I have this project, I think it would be so great at the Hyde Park Jazz Festival because I know you're really interested in X. That makes me feel like you paid attention to what we're doing, that you have thought about how your work connects to that, and that you're sort of saying, like, my interest is connected to your interest, and so if we combine them, it would be great. Does that make sense? I think you cannot go wrong with that. With with any, I think, promoter or presenter, is to think about them first and what they're doing and how your work connects to it.
It's one of the things I love about doing these interviews is I just learned like what my next pitch email is going to be like, so that's helpful. We can hang for a second if you want to come down and have a conversation, but please thank Kate Dumbleton.